Okay, sorry about that delay at the beginning. So here is our conceptualization for chapter one, trying to like walk you through so you sort of see the big picture before you go ahead and read. And the very first thing that is featured in chapter one are they talk about Native American societies before the Columbian Exchange, before contact with before contact, permanent contact began in 1492. And a couple of the things that will be emphasized in the textbook is that there is a massively diverse group of indigenous people, and most of which we know about comes from archaeology. And people are making their best guesses. You'll even see that there's, a lot of debates in there about how many people lived in North America prior to Columbus's contact. Through archaeology, historians have determined that there were complex societies, and that there was an agricultural revolution that allowed for permanent settlement. It wasn't just a bunch of nomads or hunter-gatherers. And that, of course, there was contact prior to Columbus, whether it was the Irish monks, whether it was the Vikings. There are people suspect the Romans. None of that matters for our context. It's when Columbus lands in 1492 that you see permanent contact, and you start to see a permanent exchange between the two societies. So the textbook starts out by basically going through several thousand years saying, look, there are a lot of unknowns, but there were a lot of different ways in which people interacted with their environment, had their civilization determined by their environment, and there were different degrees of complexity, but there were permanent established civilizations. All right. Then they go into, before we get to the first Europeans coming over, this is HWC stuff, okay? I don't know what you learned about the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages. I mean, they're basically the same thing. The Middle Ages slash Dark Ages is what, 500 to 1500. And it's during that time, like when the Middle Ages began, Western Europe is the backwater of the earth. It might be the worst place on earth. It is, again, this really, take that woman next year for European history. You'll really get in a lot of depth on this. But Europe is barely surviving. The world is incredibly small during the Middle Ages. Remember learning about, feudalism, which is basically, this reciprocal arrangement between lords and vassals for military service, and the manor system where the economy was really small. Look, I'm not turning this into European history, but what I want you to see is around the time of Columbus, the late 15th century, you start to see the rise of these national monarchs. Remember learning about that stuff, right? The development of national monarchies in Portugal, in Spain, in England, in the Netherlands. And if you did not have the rise of the nation state, nobody is undertaking exploration. Okay, you have no Columbian exchange, you have no permanent contact until Europe had to develop itself politically first. And again, you should have gotten that in ninth grade. You'll certainly get that next year in European history. That's just kind of a crash course from me. Okay, the Spanish come first. Okay, yes, the Portuguese led exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, Balboa, or not Balboa, excuse me, Diaz. Who am I trying to think of? Yeah, the name escapes me right now. Bartolome Diaz, da Gama, excuse me, yes. It is the Spanish that establish contact in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere. The first phase is discovery, that is Columbus and his voyages. What motivated Columbus? He is a religious zealot. You will see that. Regardless of his own personal shortcomings, of which there are many, guys, he sailed to America 10 weeks of dead reckoning. He didn't use any instruments. He looked at the sun, he looked at the stars, and got his boat across the Atlantic Ocean. Again, the Columbian Exchange is important while he's not the first to cross the Atlantic. And it is incredibly ethnocentric to say that, America is discovered. What Columbus gets credit for is the contact that led to the first permanent, continuing exchange of goods, people, ideas. We are not venerating him. We are putting him in the context of this is when we started to see permanent European contact with the Western Hemisphere, which is the beginning of this course. The second phase is god awful, horrible. It is the conquistador phase. You will read about their motives. It's one, it's money, right? As Cortez lands in the New World in Mexico and burns his ship so his men are motivated. What does he say? I have come here to win gold, not to plow fields like a peasant. And this handful of men, through ruthless means, conquers large numbers of people. Read about that. The third phase is the colonization phase, right? And what's kind of unique is as we go down here to the Spanish model, very few Spaniards came to the Western Hemisphere. They were able to rule over a large number of people. And Spain, their mines in the Western Hemisphere produced 10 times the value of all other gold and silver mines combined. And while they cranked that out in the 16th and 17th century, they are stinking rich in a world power, but they developed nothing. They developed nothing at home in terms of infrastructure. And there's very little that is developed in the Western Hemisphere. It's about exploit, get money. At the heart of Spanish colonization were the missions. Catholicism is kind of a big deal in Spain, guys. You could not be considered Spanish if you were not Catholic, right? The church, that was part of the Spanish national identity, and no dissent at all was tolerated. The church played a major role in Spanish society. You also had Spain spreading to North America, whether it is in Spanish Florida or in New Mexico, and their system of rule, which led to a couple of revolts. You'll read in particular about the Pueblo Revolt. Spain really did not try to develop its own colonial economy. Everything existed. We'll talk about mercantilism in a little bit. Everything is sent back through to Spain. There's only 2 voyages made a year, and they had to be made out of Spanish ports because, again, Spain is not trying to recreate its own little Spain in the New World. You have a very small number that's going to exert tremendous control over the local population. There is a tremendous labor shortage, and everything that Spain is trying to do in the New World is to get control of as many people as possible to work primarily in mines and then on plantations such as sugar plantations. You'll see the most horrifying numbers, about 95% of population disappearing in just a number of years. As we mentioned, the cultural exchange, both in terms of like what Spain brings to the New World, but also New World goods. The potato is kind of important, and corn is kind of important that go back to Europe. Spain tried to create this unique racial hierarchy where you had the few Spanish at the top, the many Indians at the bottom, and in between were the peoples of mixed blood, because Spanish men intermarried because there weren't Spanish women, and those were the mestizos. But one of the things that we spend a lot of time developing in AP US history is that race is a social construct, i.e. there's no science behind it. We just simply made it up. We'll use a lot of examples for that as we go through the course. Spain could not keep that, and if one became wealthy enough and was mestizo, one became Spanish in terms of race. There were many systems of labor, most rather unfree to the Indians, but as there was a shortage, and as sugar, which is indescribably labor intensive and the worst possible job on earth, maybe working on a sugar plantation, Europeans unfortunately turned to African slavery, and it talks about how that originated, and control passed. It was maybe the most lucrative trade in Europe. It's god-awful, horrible. I'm presenting it here in the context of it being important to the European economy. First, it was controlled by the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, and then the Dutch, and then finally the English. And you certainly do not have the development of Western Hemisphere colonies without the horror of African slavery. Just a few things here as we really get rolling in period 2 with the English. There were early attempts at colonization, the failed attempt of Gilbert in Newfoundland, the failed attempt of Raleigh at Roanoke. The first successful attempt that lasts is going to be 1607 in Jamestown with the Virginia Company. That is where the next chapter starts, as well as the next time period. The English had a lot of reason to colonize, a lot. Look, without turning it into European history, they're overpopulated. You can make money with wool. Landowners enclose their lands. Sort of like that old feudal arrangement disappears. There are so many landless people in England, so many. And as wool is being raised, food isn't being raised, and they have not experienced their agricultural revolution yet. So there's not enough land. So much of land is being dedicated to sheep and not growing food. You have a lot of people that are willing to take the massive risk and come over and populate British North America. You also are going to have a tremendous amount of religious dissenters. You have Puritans that are, and you have separatist groups, right? Including like the Quakers. You have Puritans that have fallen out of favor with the ruling Anglican Church. You also had a model they talk about of conquering Ireland in the late 16th century. And this is important because the Irish are the first group to mass immigrate in the United States, really starting in 1845, and the inherited English tradition of how they viewed the Irish is a big deal for how this first group immigrating en masse to the United States is treated. And anyways, it is this perspective that the Irish are an inferior race that guides how the English, they're not British yet, the English colonized Ireland, and that's the same model they're going to follow with the Indians in North America. The French, our book really has very little. Our old textbook really described the importance of missionaries and furs. They have an incredibly small population, but that really small population does not live on the coast like the English and deal with people in the interior. They go in the interior. The missionaries, the Jesuit missionaries, go into the interior and establish good relations with Indian tribes. The Coureurs du Bois go into the interior to trade, right? It's not like they trap all the beavers themselves. They are engaged in trading with various Indian tribes. So bottom line is a small group, and like Quebec is founded a year after Jamestown in 1608, and it never really, as we get a little bit later, the French government tries to populate it. It never gets too populated, but it is going to become the eventual rival with the English for North America, where we're going to fight 3 wars for control of North America, the last one being the decisive one, which I know you've learned about, the French and Indian War that's coming. And there's going to be a small Dutch presence in North America, as the Dutch had hired Henry Hudson to go up the Hudson River. He claimed all of that for the Netherlands. And there's a short-lived colony at New Amsterdam, New York City. So there you go. That's sort of like what you will get out of chapter number 1. So good luck.